Welcome to Hacker Practice, the show where I introduce you to brilliant practitioners who share their principles, strategies, and tactics for mitigating risk in a complex world. Our goal is to bring about a grand biological abstraction. My name is Justice Epen, and I'll be your host. Today's guest is the unofficial frontman for one of the fastest growing fields of computer science. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, CNN, NPR, Wired, TechCrunch, just about everywhere. This guy is a modern-day Renaissance man, Mr. Big Data himself, Jesse Anderson. Welcome to Hacker Practice, Jesse. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, Justice.
Awesome. Now, we were just talking about the weather out in Reno where you're located. You wanna just tell the audience what you're sort of experiencing right now?
You remember in Empire Strikes Back when they first start coming in and there's the massive snow drifts and the walkers? I'm just waiting for the walkers to come out. We've got about 2 or 3 feet on the ground and it just got done snow blowing. It's not fun.
Well, that sounds awesome. And you've got a family, so they're out enjoying the weather, I'm sure, right now. I want to talk a little bit at first about how we met. Jesse, can you share with us a little context?
Sure. We went on a cruise together. It was one of those weird cruises where it wasn't going with family. We were going with new friends, friends we hadn't met yet. So we are all, I told people it was a personal development cruise, which they kind of looked at me weird. But in many ways, we all grew as people and grew as individuals. And as a result of sharing that experience, we were all able to become good friends afterwards.
Yeah, and the format of the cruise was 7 or 8 people, and we all gave workshops to one another. I want to know from your perspective, what was the most practical lesson you learned on the cruise, Jesse?
Let's see, one of the most practical lessons I actually learned from you, and it was about we react more strongly to negative than we do to positive. So Justice was able to find my Achilles heel in terms of motivating me. I usually stay pretty motivated, don't really have to deal with a lot of the motivation tricks, but that definitely was one of the biggest motivators I've had in a while. And if you find whatever that negative motivator is, I was able to take that out and start. And instead of talking to people about positive things, which is normally how I message, when there's a much stronger negative, I usually message on the negative now, where if you don't do this, you will feel this big, big, big pain.
Wow. I am so excited to hear that you got lasting value out of that conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about the context that that lesson came up in?
Yeah, we were doing let's see, it was your session, your and Tasia's session, and we talked a little bit about let's see, business. We were doing our business strategy. What it turned out to be was a business strategy for me, but it was more of a personal strategy. Where do you want to be? What are you good at? What are those sorts of things? So I've generally found those out. I've generally figured them out. I run my own business. So a lot of what I want to do in my business life and in my career life is to get better with business and in my business. And so that was the context of that, of what would motivate me to take certain actions within the business.
Right. And it was essentially a miniature coaching session. And I think the part that you're talking about in terms of reacting strongly to negatives was I asked you to set some stakes around a certain behavior that you wanted to adopt in your business marketing practices. And we agreed that sort of a fear of loss is a greater motivator than expectation of reward.
Yeah, that's right. What would be the penalty if I didn't do that thing that I wanted to do.
Awesome. And I talk about fear of loss a lot on my blog, and I'd be happy to get into that some more in a variety of different contexts. But I also want to, continue this conversation about the cruise and hear about the workshop that you did on creativity because it was one of my favorite workshops on the cruise. I am obsessed with philosophies of creativity. Can you talk to me about your thesis on creativity?
Yeah, my general thesis on creativity is that everyone is inherently creative, but it's a muscle that we actually exercise. So if you've let that muscle go dormant, your creativity will be much less. If you exercise that on a daily basis or several times a day, it'll be this muscle that can just produce. You can create and do some really great things. So what I talk to and I teach engineers, and by and large, people consider engineers to be not creative people, and I disagree with that they're not creative people. I think they're not creative people right now, that they've not really focused themselves. They really haven't spent the time in order to exercise their creativity. So I think it's an incredibly important thing. It's also a massively distinguishing factor between people, where an engineer who is creative versus an engineer who isn't creative there's a palpable difference. I'll give you a concrete example. When I teach, sometimes I'll give them just a very bare bones thing. Well, I'll say, you come up with an idea for doing something, and I'll get all these blank looks of, but what should I do? And tell me what to do. And I think that's a sad state of where we're at, where we've taught our engineers that they don't need to be creative, when the opposite is true. They absolutely need to be creative. You may have read about AI and that sort of thing, and how AI is going to change our business and change this and that. And what's going to happen within programming is that we'll have the equivalence of AI. We'll have something that helps us write code. We'll have something that goes through Stack Overflow. But what's going to be the distinguishing factor between the good engineers and the engineers with jobs and that sort of thing? It's going to be those who are creative. Those are going to who are going to be able to synthesize the ideas, to think things through, and actually create and ideate on new products and technologies.
So this is a great point of discussion because I'm a hacker, a developer, but I've also got a lot of experience in design, and I consider myself pretty full stack. Can you sort of translate a little bit of this knowledge that you have on creativity from an engineering standpoint to a step up to the entrepreneurship perspective?
So the entrepreneurship is, at its core, it's ideas. So let me give you an example from my personal experience. I always thought that entrepreneurship meant that you created this brand new industry that never existed before, that you were the JD Rockefeller, that you were the so on and so forth, that you created a social media company that was completely different. Rather, I'm starting to see that there are the big businesses that create a brand new technology or a category, but then there's also the ones that figured out a better way to do something that's already existing. And that already existing is something like, for training. Training already existed, big data training already existed, but by being able to create and ideate around, how do I teach better? How do I reach people in a way that makes them relate to things even easier? And technologies, and how I even all the way down to the people that I teach. Most training is focused on the actual engineers. I also focus on the entrepreneurs and the management side. So it's taking something that's already there and then ideating around that of, what could I do that will be creative and change something that's existing. And that's one of the ways I encourage entrepreneurs to think about creativity, that you can really come up with a brand new thing in an existing category and distinguish yourself.
This is really interesting to me, and I want to dive in a little bit deeper a little bit later in the episode, because Peter Thiel talks about this idea of unity across disparate technology domains, and you actually talk about that in your book, which we will talk about a little bit later in the episode. I want to jump into a question that Michael Alexis actually told me that he was really interested in. I'm also really interested in some of these ideas. It's a non-technical idea. Jesse, you're a self-educated man. Can you talk about your experience with education, with self-education, and sort of your philosophy of learning?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm entirely self-educated. So to give you an example or an idea of what that means, I was walking into to guest lecture at a college classroom. This was going to be a master's level and PhD level. And as I'm walking in, the professor's asking me what level or where I went to college at, and I said, I've never stepped foot into a college classroom unless I'm lecturing it or guest lecturing it. And so my perception of education is very different than most people's as a result, where I view education in two ways. I view there's education where that's something that I'm interested in, intellectually stimulating for me. Usually that's around history, specifically Greek and Roman, ancient Greek and Roman history, some medieval. So those are interesting things. I just learn about them because I find them interesting. And then there's learning, which makes you money, and I distinguish those two. What I found that people that go through mostly secular education don't really distinguish those two, that they've been programmed to learn, or they've learned to learn and learn to regurgitate, but they never get that I learn because I love things, and I learn because I know I'm going to make money off this thing that I'm learning.
So this is great because it's essentially education for fun and education for profit. And you're extremely good at both. When we spent time together, I was really impressed with the breadth of your knowledge, which, so to be clear and full disclosure, I am also self-educated. You have much more experience than me, and so I've got a lot to learn. I think that coming from a background where you skip college, you tend to have some pretty strong opinions on it. We try to look at things on this podcast through the lens of risk. I'm curious, do you think that college is a bigger risk than most people think?
I think it's at its core is that college doesn't teach you how to learn. I see this in my classes very often. People who went through colleges have never learned how to learn. By that I mean when you have understood how you personally learn, what are the things that motivate you in learning, the tricks and tips that you go with learning. If you've done that and you've had to learn on your own, you have that down. What I found is that the people who went through college really haven't learned how they learned. And as a result of that, when they go out and there's new technologies or they have to generalize some idea, they have a difficult time. Other risks that I see is there's obviously the big risk of the debt around that. The other biggest one I see is that there is a considerable gap between academia and the real world or companies. So academia, you're, let's say, taking, for example, a computer science. Well, what you're learning in computer science in university is different than what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. The two do not mirror each other, unfortunately. So as a result, we have people coming out with ideas and understandings that they'll have to learn brand new things. I also hear this in the business world and marketing world, that what an MBA learns is not is not going to help you actually start a business and run a business. And it's other things that I found interesting. Once again, going back to technical, there are frameworks for how things are run day to day. One of those is called Agile. In most university classes, that isn't taught at all. What's happening is that the people who are brand new aren't productive on day one. And that's a big issue for me in seeing that. So it's a massive risk to those people who are taking these college classes that, one, can they even go into the real world? Well, I've had to be in the real world from day one. Kind of the corollary risk there is for me to, I think in terms of practicality for everything. Everything has to work in a practical real world. I really don't think in terms of the theoretical models. So I find that for me, whenever I look at something, it has to work real world. It's not a theoretical thing. And that's kind of a detriment on my side, is I don't really think about, read through this paper and find this theoretical thing. I'm looking for practical real world things.
So this is super interesting because I'm hearing a couple parts to the answer here, which is a big risk in going to college is that you are risking or you are losing out on the opportunity to gain metacognitive skills, the learning to learn, the learning how you as an individual learn, which isn't really a priority in college and higher education curriculums. So that's one part. And the second part, which you mentioned in a roundabout way, is this idea that when you go to college, you go with an anticipation that it will prepare you for the real world, but because the curriculum is not actually based in the real world, then when you do get out of university and go find a job, the business then has to incur the expense of training you for the real world, which seems almost like a bait and switch. Like university says, hey, come to college, learn how to perform in the real world. Then you go to the real world and you still have to get trained on that anyway.
Yeah, it's a definite risk, and it's something that makes companies risk averse. And I see this with people starting out. They're saying, "Well, I have this college degree in CS, and I can't convince anybody to take a chance on me." And that's the issue that you were just talking about. The chance the business has to take on you is they've seen we hire all these college people coming straight out of college, and the issue with them is they don't have this real world experience. They don't know this thing that we're doing, this other thing that we're doing. We have to train them, and as a result, they have to think, okay, well, if you're here for a year or 2 years, what's our break even point? And that break even point for somebody who new out of college may be a year and a half in.
Right. And that's a pretty scary prospect. And we're going to get to some of your experience in training and educating others in a minute. But before we do, I want to ask one more question on this sort of college self-education topic. You know, you've got a couple of kids, and that must inform to some degree how you view higher education. What is the way you view higher education through the lens of being a parent?
So I'll start actually earlier than higher education. I think education starts right now. So my kids are 8 and 5, and so I'm in many ways putting my money where my mouth is, where on the creativity part, where I'm actually stressing creativity in their education earlier on. I think this is going to be what will distinguish the children of the future, that they're not going to be sitting around memorizing trivia. They're not going to be memorizing this or that. They'll have some kind of maybe a Google Assistant, maybe some kind of AI that's bringing a lot of this data up for them. So the stress on memory and that sort of memorization road, I think, is not what we should be doing. So I have them in Waldorf education, which stresses much more of the problem solving, the creativity, interpersonal skills. I think that's what's going to be the differentiating factor for 20, 10, 15 years from now when my kids enter the education market. So skipping forward to once we hit university, I personally don't stress the whole university model to my kids. My family, my wife's family does, where they say when you're going to go get a college education because that's the formula for getting a job and being successful. And I'm much less. I'm not saying pessimistic, but I'm curious about what college will look like in 10 to 15 years, and in comparison to other methods, that will have better online courses, we'll have this, we'll have that. Will there actually be a specific need for that college degree? So what I generally focus my kids on is creativity, interpersonal skills, problem solving, because if they really master those sorts of things, then I think they'll be far more successful than the I have a degree. They'll be able to show actual quantifiable, this is what I do.
How do you handle the discrepancy in opinion about higher education that you have with your wife and her family?
They kind of know where I come from. That in terms of if you were to quantify my level of education, so once again I'm completely self-taught, I would have the equivalent of a PhD. And I've taught people with PhDs before. They've come through my classes. I've had professors come through my classes. So this isn't something that I really try to get into or lord over them, or it isn't a subject for discussion. I'm more, if somebody engages me, I'll talk about the need for real world versus very theoretical endeavors.
Yeah. I've found that with certain contrarian positions, especially this one, as someone who is not pro college, I find that it's often the typical response, the default response to someone who is not pro college is that the other person is baffled. It seems like they are completely surprised that you could possibly even consider being not pro college. So I think it's a really interesting contrarian position to look at, and I will certainly continue exploring this with you in personal conversations.
So
Um,
one
Go
thing I
ahead.
want to clarify is I differentiate schooling and education. There's a great Mark Twain quote that he says, "I've never let my schooling interfere with my education." So I am incredibly pro education. My kids are going to, and I educate ourselves very well. But conflating education with schooling are two different things.
Well said. My next question is more about your day to day. Can you tell me, in the simplest possible terms, what is big data?
Big data, in its simplest possible terms, is data that is so big or so massive that it takes several different computers to work together to do it. So some great examples of that are when I tell people what I do, I say I teach companies to deal with data at the level that Facebook and Google deal with it at, where Facebook has 1.5 billion people, Google has a significant number of people using it. They need special systems in order to be able to handle that load and process that much data.
Okay, so it's the point at which that you have so much data that you need multiple computers to deal with it. What what so this actually isn't a single technology. This is more of a whole school of thought, or can you tell me more, like, what does the domain entail?
So there's the domain entails when once you have big data and you have that massive amount of data, you can't use existing systems. You can't use MySQL if you're familiar with that,
Yep.
or SQL Server or something along those lines. What you actually have to do is you have to use specialty systems that are written for big data. So if you've ever heard the technology called Hadoop, that's one of those. So there's as you mentioned, there's an entire ecosystem around big data where there's all these programs
Mm-hmm.
that are specifically and created specifically for handling big data. So they're often open source, very often Apache licensed. Some are closed source. That means that they're sold by a company and that you don't have access to the source code.
Mm. So essentially, with all this technology and ecosystem around big data is really just a problem.
Yeah, it's a problem. Another way I like to talk about what big data means or is you remember the Supreme Court decision around pornography, where they couldn't define what big data was. They could only say you'll know it when you see it.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the definition I use as well. Is there are definitions. I personally don't like those definitions. I prefer you'll know it when you see it, because I'll come in and I'll train at companies and they'll say, "Hey, this job is taking 3 days to run. Literally 3 days, a single job." And so what you'll have is you'll have a big data problem, and it's much easier to say, this job takes 3 days. I really need to get that down to 5, 8 hours or something like that. And by using big data technologies, you can do that.
And I've heard you put it in terms of the language that your engineers use when describing the problem. Can you talk a little bit about that theory?
Yeah, and that's can't. So can't do it. And when you go to your engineer, let's say you're a manager or you're a CXO or VP, and they say, or even if you're in a different business unit and you're saying, I need to get this from the data, I need to analyze the data this way or that, and they say can't. And that's one of the other ways I define big data, is that you go to somebody and they say can't do that because it will take too long, can't do that, it's too big, can't do that, it's so on and so forth. So there were, over my career, there were always different can'ts that we couldn't do, of doing, for example, a full table scan on the relational database. where there was some really interesting insights we could have pulled out. We could have understood our customers much better. The issue there was that we could never do that, once again can't, because of the technical limitations. So when you remove those technical limitations via big data, you can actually go through and say, oh, wow, we can do this now. And when I teach management teams, I encourage them, go back to those ideas where somebody said can't, and let's try them again. Let's see what exactly it looks like now that you've went to a big data technology.
So this leads me to my next question, because we're going to stick with sort of the practical side here for our audience, which is probably mostly startup founders, SMB owners, that sort of person. What is your practical advice for big data, or what does the average startup founder, SMB, small business owner need to know about big data? What do they need to know, and what is your practical advice for them, especially around team building, since that's part of your expertise?
Sure, I'll answer the two questions. So, what should a business owner know? And then second, how should their team be laid out? The biggest thing, the most core thing that you should know as a business owner is, do you have big data? That's a pretty big fast pass fail thing. The second part of that is, will you have big data? So if you're a startup, if you are a small business or something like that, more than likely you don't have big data yet. So that means that you'll have to make a decision if you're going to say, I'm going to shoot for the moon and we're going to be bigger than Google. Then you need to start thinking about your business along those terms of, do I want to handle this? Do I want to scale this now, or do I want to scale this later? That's a very, very important decision that you make. And you need to make that with your engineering folks, with your business development folks, because I liken this to a train speeding towards a wall. If you are using small data technologies for a big data problem, you'll eventually be the speeding train towards a wall. You could be 2 years out, you could be 4 years out, you could be 1 year out, you could be a few months out. Depending on how far out you are, you're going to have to really, really focus and really decide on what you're going to do. The second big thing a business owner needs to know is that for big data, you can't just get some guy off the street. And that just doesn't mean a programmer. That means that a programmer that's doing big data isn't your web guy usually. So you can't say, hey, I have this guy writing some JavaScript for me, and by the way, go write some big data code for me. That usually results in some pretty terrible abominations. Yes. If you haven't already realized, I'm known for my blunt style, both in verbally and in written word. And that's one of the reasons people come to me and enjoy my stuff, is I don't beat around the bush on what should be done and how things should be done. This has to be this way. Otherwise, you'll just fail.
So I want to just call out the 3 points that I think I just heard. The one is the first two are questions. Do I currently have big data? And the second question is, will I ever have big data? And with the second question, especially with startups, I think it's really interesting, given the nonlinear growth curve, that at any moment a startup could go from being a small data company to a large data company. Do you have any stories or experience with sort of unexpectedly making a transition from small to big data?
Sure, I'll actually answer both of those. So I've seen it both ways, and I actually talk about the both ways I've seen it. I call it paying the piper. So you're going to have to pay the piper eventually, whether so I was at a startup where we would have hit big data problems. The startup went under before it actually hit that, and we didn't put the effort into doing big data. So I guess in that sense it paid off, because doing big data takes longer. It's not like you can bust out features as quickly and that sort of thing. The other side is I've seen companies hit that brick wall, and I see this more often with large enterprises where they have this thing called technical debt. Mm-hmm. Technical debt means that there's been a problem. That problem's been around for a while, and they've just chosen to ignore it, or to try and band-aid it, or put the finger in the dike to see how long they can live without it.
And specifically, technical debt is a technical problem, generally the business owner might not even know about it if they are not also an engineer.
I would say if the business at the CX level, they may not know about it. At the mid-tier levels to VP levels, if they don't know about that, you've got you have two problems now. You have a problem, a technical problem, and you have a personnel problem because people aren't doing their jobs.
Which happens all the time. Engineers incur technical debt in order to hit deadlines, and in doing so, and then hide the technical debt so that the boss man doesn't realize that there's a problem.
Usually it's the opposite. Usually these engineers are screaming about the technical debt to their frontline manager, who is then either not passing that on to make themselves look good, or that I more often see it that the management side is keeping that from the higher ups.
Okay, so a lot of the time, middle management can be harboring some of these unseen technical debt problems.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to shift from thinking about founders and owners thinking about big data. Hey, do I have a big data problem? Will I have a big data problem? How do I prepare? How do I hire the right people? And we'll get back into the team building, especially. But then I want to shift into a different demographic. I'm your average full stack hacker, right? I've got web interests. I've got native interests. I'm building things on Raspberry Pis. I'm just like an all around hacker, maybe not working professionally in big data. Where do I get started? What do I do to learn the basics of big data? We've talked about this a little bit before, but I want to hear it again.
So the basics of big data can be picked up a few different ways. I have an online course. You can go through that. It teaches you how to do everything. One of the big things that, depending on what your definition of hacker or where you are in your abilities, it isn't difficult programmatically to do big data in terms of here is the difficulty of this design pattern and here's the difficulty. The difficulty of big data usually lies in the system creation in terms of understanding how data is moved around between all these things. So if you could go that route. In years past, I've hacked. I've went through all sorts of different, hacked around with different technologies. That's how I got started with Linux. And that sort of inquisitive person is a person I like to see on data engineering teams because they're not constrained to this is exactly what I do and keeping that down to this is a very small piece. So I like to see data engineers have that sort of hacker mentality in terms of I'm going to learn this technology and I have and to be multidisciplinary. Other ways that they can go and learn things. There's obviously some stuff on Coursera. Most things out there just give the basics, and that's an issue that I found is when you go pay $100 or whatever at that Coursera class, you're going to learn a bunch of basics. It may or may not be helpful. It may or may not be taught very well. The people who are doing the sort of online things usually aren't actual trainers who've taught extensively. Usually they're a software engineer who may or may not know how to teach, and that's a general issue. So one of the big things I'd look for is a person who has mastery and who teaches well, who understands things, who has things prepared for you so that you can understand and learn. And that will help you out significantly in that journey.
Okay, so you've got an online course. We're going to link to that. There are other courses available on Coursera, etc. Obviously, looking for the right kind of coach is incredibly important. Big data. Is big data, in your eyes, a business asset or a business liability?
It can be a little bit of both. If you aren't leveraging your data, you've got a massive liability. One thing I find interesting is in learning about, as I've cross-trained into marketing heavily, how much it should be based in analysis of data. So if you have a business and you're unable to analyze that data because of the sheer scale and understanding your customer is impossible due to the sheer scale of your data, you have a problem. You have a liability there that a CXO, a VP should be screaming saying, why can't we get at this data? Why can't we understand this customer? Why can't we do this? When I teach a management team, I teach them ideate, so figure out something you want to do, and then establish a business value on that. If you could do this analytic, you could make $2 million more, $5 million more. And then from there, you can make a pretty easy ROI decision on that of, should I go this route? So the asset, it can be both an asset liability. If you aren't saving your data, if you aren't processing your data, so I'll take a step back there since a good portion of your audience is probably on the beginning side. Storing data is cheap. Even if you're bootstrapping a startup, save all of your data from the very beginning. This could be helpful later on in terms of helping a data scientist or some kind of analysis, or even for your investors where you can say, hey, we started at 0 and in our first year we went to X, second year we went to Y, so on and so forth. So keeping that data around it's cheap. You put it in S3, you put it in Cloud Store. It's pennies to store that data. The value in that data, and this is where part of what a culture change in your company needs to be, is the perception of the value of data. That let's say somebody were to delete or say, hey, we don't need to keep that around. It should be setting off alarm bells and within the company where people are saying, no, we'd never delete data. So it's very, very important that companies have that mindset.
Okay, so a culture of data storage, presumably with the expectation of future payout of some kind.
Yeah, not so much. I wouldn't say a culture of data storage, a culture of value, perception of value of data. Mm-hmm. That whatever is tangentially related to that value of data, everybody needs to be focused on that. Whether that's storage, whether that's analytics, everybody needs to have that perception.
So, Jesse, you've been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Wired, the BBC, NPR, TechCrunch, other major outlets that I haven't got listed here. How did you get that coverage? What are your tips for getting coverage in major outlets like that?
So the original project that I got all that coverage on was my Million Monkeys project. You can go to my site at jesse-anderson.com and you can read about it. And so at its core, it was, if you've ever heard the saying that a million monkeys on a million typewriters will eventually recreate Shakespeare, that's what I did. I used big data technologies to recreate every work of Shakespeare all at once. So there's some interesting parts of that. You can read up all my write-ups on that.
Well, wait a minute. Talk me through it. Like, it's okay if we get a little bit technical here. I'm a technical guy. I have to know, like, what are the details? How did you do this?
Sure. Yeah. So I had to. So if you want to know the statistics, I'm published in a statistical journal on that specific topic. In fact, I was even cited recently in a statistical college statistics book. So you can go read that if you want to have some good late night reading. So at its core, if you were to do it the traditional route, it would take longer than the lifetime of the universe to actually do it and generate it randomly all at once. Mm-hmm. So what I had to do is break it down into a smaller amount. I did it 9 characters at a time, mm-hmm. and randomly. So the very basic algorithm was randomly generate some 9 characters, see if they appeared in Shakespeare. If they did appear, then mark it. And it just did that over and over 1.5 trillion times.
Okay, and can you talk about why that is a tremendous computing problem? Like how difficult that would be for your average small data programmer to achieve this?
So I won't talk about the programmer. I'll talk about more of the technology, small data technology. Why would that be difficult with a small data technology? So one of the reasons I don't like the general way that people define big data is that they miss out on one of on this manifestation of it takes a long time to do something. So in this case, Shakespeare, if you've ever looked at how much Shakespeare wrote in his life, he was lazy. He wrote about 3 megabytes worth of data. So a lazy guy wrote 3 megabytes and then changed English history. But he 3 megabytes isn't big data on any level. So it's in that sense, this wasn't a big data project. However, once you start getting into the random recreation and then the exponential growth of trying to find a certain number of things randomly, then it becomes a big data problem. And you'll need the special skills, you'll need to do things like that. So when I did the project initially, it took a month and a half to do that. To actually, once I had written the code, just running, my computer at home ran for a month and a half doing this and would update and show things. And so it was covered initially. In fact, when I first started that, it was I think I was in Fox News, I was in Gadget the first time.
So you had one machine computing all the random character generation?
Yeah,
Okay.
initially, and so that the point I would want people to take away from this is that yes, that one machine, I wanted people to see what one machine could do, and then what I did later on was Amazon gave me a gift certificate. You can go read that post, and I ran, instead of running on 10 machine or one machine, I actually used that same code, didn't change it at all, on 20 machines, and as a result, that took that month down to a week. So this is what big data means for businesses. For that is that you can take a very, very complex thing, break it up onto two different machines, or 10 machines, or 100 machines, and have them run all at once and get a response back in, let's say, a week or a day. So wall clock time, let's say you were to total all that together, it's still a month and a half or so, but by splitting it up, you're able to take it down to a week. The business value I try to get people to take out of this is, if you have some kind of analytic, and that analytic takes a month and a half to run, the value of that is negligible, because probably after that month and a half, whatever response you got is unactionable, it's changed. If you can get that response back in a day or an hour or a few hours, now you have a company that is data augmented, that is focused on data and can act on data and change accordingly.
Right. And you, being an individual using 20 Amazon cloud servers to conduct this calculation in a week, that's actually different from a corporation that could probably afford to spin up 5 or 10 times that number of computers and really solve an incredibly complex algorithm in a matter of hours or days.
So that's actually a funny thing. Somebody from Google emailed me one time, and they were talking about this guy that they worked with that would actually do very similar things to what I did with the monkeys algorithm, except he would do it with Google stuff. So yes, kind of to your point, somebody who works at Google got to spin up and do a lot of infinite monkey theorem. That's the technical term for it, infinite monkey theorem.
Infinite monkey theorem. I want to jump into this Google thing real quick, because I saw that you are a Google partner using their cloud technologies. I've trained on some of their cloud technologies before. Do you have any just brief analysis on sort of their cloud platform, and for startups especially, if you would prefer Google's cloud platform over, for example, AWS?
So I'll break it down a few different ways. Probably one of the biggest ones is availability of people with knowledge of Google Cloud versus AWS. Mm-hmm. So you'll have more people with AWS backgrounds than GCP or Google Cloud Platform. That said, I don't think that the level of difficulty between the two is that different. So if they understand AWS, they'll probably understand GCP, where it's very similar concepts of spinning up things, it's containerization, it's that sort of thing. The reason I personally prefer, and I like the technology from Google, is one, it's cheaper. Overall, it's quite a bit cheaper than AWS. Other things that I like about Google is they'll actually proactively do things for you that you have to do manually with AWS. if you're familiar with AWS, they have reserved instance types.
Hmm.
Those are one where you have to kind of calculate out and say, okay, am I going to use this VM for a month? Okay, I should use this instance type. And I think they're inconveniencing their users with something that they really shouldn't be thinking about. One thing I like about Google's route is that if you run an instance for a month, they'll give you that discount immediately. So you don't have to try and go through things. You don't have to jump through some hoops. So I think it's AWS adds some layers of complication that I don't like to see. More from the technology side, I like the technology that Google is making available. Some of those are Google PubSub. I really like what they do with Bigtable. So Bigtable is another big data technology. So to kind of take a step back and give you some more overview of what Hadoop is. So Hadoop is the open source implementation of some papers that Google did, that Google wrote. And one of those is Hadoop. Another one of those is called HBase. So in those terms, you can use HBase. You could spin up your own HBase cluster, or you could use Google's Bigtable and not have to do that, not have to deal with the ops side. So for me, it's thinking about it from why should we be in the operations business, especially at a startup level, at a small business level. I don't think we should be in the operations business. We should be in creating value, and operationally, we don't create value directly. If things go down, hey, that's a big deal. That's not creating value. But I think as businesses, we should be creating value for our customers and focusing on that rather than reinventing wheels around infrastructure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So we talked about how you got that sort of initial press coverage. I think it points back to side project marketing, really, this Million Monkeys project that you did. It's kind of, side project marketing seems to be the hot thing in digital marketing these days, and with good reason. I got my first 1,000 followers from a side project that I did. People love good calendars, I guess. And I think that you're sort of reiterating on that. And then, Google versus AWS. I've tried Google before as well, and it does seem, at least from the technologist point of view, a little bit more intuitive and powerful, and the cost differences are certainly significant. So I think we can move on from those topics. My next question is about your career as this. You are Mr. Big Data, right? You are the person that people go to when they need like the best person in the world to be looking at their big data problems. I want to know, as the person who occupies that niche, what do you see as being like the biggest threats to your career? Market forces, changing technology, something else entirely?
So it's the realm of big data is changing quite a bit. So and especially in the real time side of things. So I generally stay on the cutting edge. The people who come to me are looking for the cutting edge technologies. So in that sense, I'm actually the one that's doing the thought leadership and pushing the advances in technology. So that in that sense, I'm leading the way through that. The biggest ones is around the point that I expect to happen in the future. This will probably happen in maybe 10 years from now, maybe 5 years from now at the low end, is that we'll get away from differentiations between big data and small data. And it will just all be data. The reason I say that is within Google, there really isn't a distinction between big data and small data in the ways we have to do it now. And that's because their frameworks are allow them to not have to make that distinction. So one of the projects I'm pretty involved with, I'm a committer on, is Apache Beam. So Apache Beam allows you to not have to make that initial decision of, am I big data, am I small data, will I have to do this rewrite? And that, I think that's going to solve a significant business need, especially for startups, for small businesses, of here, I don't have to make that decision. That is a big data decision now. I can say, I'm going to use this, and I'm going to use the right tool for the job right now. And as I grow and scale, I'll change some of the technologies behind the scenes, but won't have to make a bunch of code changes. I think that's going to be one of the big futures, and that's one of the reasons I'm getting involved in that early on is I want to see this change happen for all sorts of reasons.
Okay, so I want to do a quick recap on this because on one hand, for most engineers, the biggest threat to their career, the biggest risk that they run is that they don't stay up to date with cutting edge technologies, and they become their skill sets become essentially obsolete. So it's a huge risk for most people who work in technology. You mitigate that risk by essentially living on the cutting edge. And the next part to your answer was around the future paradigm shift that is coming, which is when small data and big data essentially cease to exist as a meaningful distinction. That, to me, at least in your position, seems like a bigger threat. What are you going to do when that day comes where big data is no longer trendy because everybody is doing it by definition?
Then I'm hoping by then I'll have built the following and the business so that people will still come to me for that learning. So in many ways the technologies are still difficult. They're still going to need your better than average programmer, and people will there's always a need for learning. And part of the shift that I've been making in my business is not just doing the tech, but also the management side of things. And I think that's a risk mitigation that I'm doing within the business.
So essentially what you will do is you will adapt to the changing market environment. You might become Mr. Data instead of Mr. Big Data. And you'll be focusing more on the business application of some of this technology and sort of advising entrepreneurs and owners on that side of the business. Is that all accurate?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Jesse, you're one of the smartest people I think I've ever met. Why do you live and work in Nevada?
I find it an interesting thing. So sometimes I'll go and teach at a company and they'll say, "Oh, you're from Nevada," and you'll get this "ooh," or you'll get this "oh wow, are you really smart? Do you really not? Should I believe that you know what you're doing?" So it was something that I didn't like to see. It was unless you are from let's say San Francisco or New York, that you weren't really doing that. So the response that I do to that now is I compete at a worldwide level now. I speak at the industry conferences worldwide. I have worldwide clients. So when people say, "Well, why aren't you in San Francisco?" I usually say, I compete worldwide. I don't just do it in San Francisco. I teach extensively in San Francisco. I teach extensively around the world. So it's been an interesting thing. So the actual reason of why Reno, Nevada, we're right by Tahoe. We've got beautiful outdoors. It's the right sort of climate that I like. So I still love snow. I still love a good hot summers. I don't know if you're listening, if you've ever been to Lake Tahoe, but it's absolutely beautiful. So I live about 20 minutes from Lake Tahoe. In many ways, I want people to be thinking about living where they want to live and doing what they want to do, rather than feeling like they have to be focused into doing this one thing.
It does seem like if you are a technologist living outside of Silicon Valley, that you're somehow missing out on something. And personally, this is something I deal with, being nomadic and moving around. And it's really reassuring to hear, hey, I live in Nevada and I'm the best in the world at what I do, and everybody, would be happy for me to come out to San Francisco, but I live where I want to live and I do what I want to do. I want to talk to you about predicting the future. We were talking about it a little bit a moment ago with the marketplace changing and the paradigm around small data versus big data changing. I think in some way, you had to be prescient to be working in big data at the right time. Did you predict the importance of big data ahead of time? And do you have any other predictions, technology predictions, social predictions that you would share with us?
Yes. So when people ask me why big data, I actually did a significant amount of my work in distributed systems. So when I started, and I've actually written distributed systems from scratch. So I know the ins and outs. I know exactly what goes into them. I know the difficulty of them, and I know how difficult it is to debug them. So when I saw what they were doing with Hadoop, and it was very, very easy for me to see this. And I was, I wouldn't say I jumped on the bandwagon. I kind of moved laterally into that, and I saw, okay, they solved the problem right. I'm seeing a significant uptick in big data. I'm seeing the need for big data where I was at that time, and that was and so when I joined Cloudera, I'm former Cloudera. That's the big data company within the space. I didn't just say, "Hey, let me join any company within big data." It was I wanted to join Cloudera. I wanted the best, and I wanted to work with the best. So that was something that was very important to me. As far as what I'd encourage people to do in the way, maybe not everybody's going to go into big data, but what I encourage people to do is think about how their skills can be moved laterally. That if you have some skills of X, I encourage you to think about how what is very lateral move that moves you higher in the end that you could make. Other predictions that I have are, and I'm usually pretty good about my predictions in terms of here is what it is and and why I think it's moving there. Our march toward real-time big data is happening with Kafka, and we have Spark streaming and that sort of thing, Apache Flink. To let me rewind things and to make another point that I hope helps the listeners. Throughout my lifetime, I've been very good at choosing technologies. I just never gave myself the credit, and I never believed in myself enough to really go with those hunches enough. So let me give you some concrete examples. I chose Java in 1996. This was pre-alpha days as one of the things that was going to be big. I chose Flash. In fact, if you've ever
If you
seen
are responsible for Flash, Jesse, we might not be friends anymore.
I'm not responsible for Flash, but I chose Flash at the time it was in the 90s. Flash was very good at what it did.
I remember.
And so, and if you actually were used it long enough, I used it before it was Flash. It used to be called Macromedia Future Splash, and I used it at that point in time. I actually said, "Hey, this is really cool. I should go with this." So in my office, I actually have a box that was in the time between Macromedia bought Future Wave and when it became part of Macromedia. Macromedia was eventually bought by Adobe.
Yep.
There was some crazy things. So I guess the point I want to make is that I had another thing I chose is that in the 90s, I knew that Internet Explorer was going to win out over Netscape at that time. And
How did you know?
How did I know that?
Yes.
It was the ease with which plugins could be installed. That was a big one. So what I want people to understand is I'd always make pretty good and accurate assumptions on things, and then I just never believed in myself enough to say I could make money and I could have a business around this. And so now when I make pretty bold predictions, people are like, yeah, I don't know. And then they'll follow up with me a year from now or a year, 2 years later, and they're like, wow, Jesse, you were exactly right.
Now, while we're talking about predictions, I really want to stop here and talk about this because you're listing out all these predictions that you made with technology, but it's not like you just made the prediction and they were sitting out in the ether somewhere, hypothetically. You studied these technologies, learned these technologies, you got skin in the game and invested in the technologies. Isn't that like a critical part of your framework for developing a career? Or talk to me about your decision-making process.
Yeah. So when I make a decision about something, let me go through my decision to go further into Apache Beam because that's the most recent and probably the most applicable to. So I knew that there was something that that I wanted to see, and it was exactly what eventually became Apache Beam. I wanted to see something where people didn't have to think in terms of big data or small data. I wanted to see something that kept people from having to think about frameworks and making a bunch of decisions around that. So I was seeing these problems. I was seeing these problems every day in my class, and I was seeing these problems in my own business of we shouldn't have these problems. Okay, so we establish a general problem, a general theme, and that's kind of a background thread that you have in your mind as you go through this and you see this, and then you go looking for the solution. And so I found the solution at Strata San Jose last year when I was speaking there. And so I met the Google folks. The Google folks are behind Apache Beam. We also have some other companies working with Apache Beam now, but it was originally came out of Google.
And what is Apache Beam exactly? Is it a server technology, or can you talk me through it?
Sure. It's a technology, it's a big data technology that was donated to the Apache Foundation that allows you not to have to think about Hadoop or Spark or a specific technology. It allows you to say, here, use this API and then run it anywhere. You could even run it on Google Cloud and not have to worry about the ops side of that. So there's some pretty cool things behind it.
So it's essentially a framework, like a framework.
Yeah. If you want to read more about Apache Beam from a management side, I've actually written 2 pieces on it specifically. You can go to my bibliography at jesse-anderson.com/bibliography and read all these pieces. I go into pretty good depth about all of this.
Okay, and just to reiterate, I'm happy to link to this article, your Million Monkeys article, and your online courses. Pretty much, we're gonna have a list of links in the show notes, so listeners will be able to find them there.
So back to the story of what when I was looking around, you establish the problem, and nobody's going to come up to you and say, "Hey, Jesse, there's this problem that you should start looking at." You're going to have to notice these things yourself, and you're going to have to have your spidey sense trained to look for these things and what the answers are. So then I started talking to people. You really have to have a let's see, I can't remember whose book it was, but he calls it the coffee house, where you need to be able to go to the coffee house and bump into people and talk to them and say, hey, I'm seeing this. Hey, I'm seeing this. What are you seeing? Hey, what have you seen that could do this? So eventually I talked to somebody from Google and I said, this is what I'm seeing. And he said, oh, that's incredible because we're doing this. I'll put you in touch with that team. They'd really love to talk to you. And so once I dug into it, I said, okay, this is exactly what I want. This is exactly solves the problem. I can get behind this. And that's the general flow that I do there.
Okay, and so you identified the problem. You went and you bumped into people, talked about the problems that you found a potential solution. Now you're working on the solution. Are you working on Apache Beam, or you're a contributor, or?
I'm a committer on Beam, so
okay.
It's going to be 05 is going to be released pretty soon, but people have it in production already. You can actually go through and read about it there on my blog as well.
Okay.
But I think it's going to be part of the future.
This is amazing because we asked, the initial question was about predictions, and an earlier prediction that you had made is that the distinction between small data and big data will cease to exist. And then in practical, like professional life, you saw this problem, you found people who are working on a solution, and you contributed to the solution. Essentially, the self-fulfilling prophecy, you're going to make the small data versus big data paradigm shift come true.
Yeah, you have to be part of making your own reality. You have to be part of creating what the future is. And if you aren't creating what the future is, then you're probably falling behind in it.
I love it. I love it. Be part of making your own reality. So my next question is about diversity. We've had some pretty intense conversations about this, but I'm going to let you take the lead on this because I know that you've done some good work in encouraging diversity in tech. What does diversity mean to you? How are you working on improving the diversity situation in technology?
So diversity means to me that we have very few minorities within big data, and this is both in the classes that I do at companies all around the world. But for this part, I generally focus on the U.S. for diversity's sake. And it's for me, it's really sad to see that I could actually go back and count the number of Hispanic or African American students that I've had, and I've never had a Native American student, which is sad to me as well. So what I kind of going back to seeing problems, I saw the problem. Nobody's screaming from the rooftops, "Hey, there's this problem." And I see this problem. I see how important it is that we do this. And so what I've done is I've created a scholarship for minority students. You can go on my site and apply for that scholarship. As long as you identify as one of those ethnicities, you'll get that. And I completely encourage this because I see a lot of talk and I hear a lot of talk about we need to do something, but my experiences and what I'm seeing is it's a mix of supply and demand issues that we don't have, at least in big data, we don't have the supply. And I really, really want to see this supply changed. I want to see more minority big data teams.
How has your scholarship done in terms of, have many people applied? How has the response been?
It really hasn't been, I really haven't gotten very much interest in it, which is sad as well, because I put a lot of effort into that and tried to get the word out. So in many ways, it's trying to get the word out. And I really do want to see this. If what I'd also like to see is I do 66%. I'd love to see another company say, "Hey, we're going to take the other 33% and we'll find people, but we'll actually give this to people who will actually use it." I really do want to see this. I really, really do want to see change.
Okay, so
and let me go ahead. And I want to talk about why I want to see this change. So there's obviously the general diversity things that we want to do, but there's also what does it look like for a business what does it look like for a team when there isn't diversity? And so I've carefully observed this. When you have a team that is of a single ethnicity, you actually have it underperforms a diverse team. Consistently underperforms a diverse team. That isn't to say that there are single ethnicity teams that don't perform well. It's more that the single ethnicity teams, by and large, and on average, underperform. And what I've found through careful observation is that a single ethnicity will have the same misunderstanding and the same backgrounds and the same thoughts and ideas. And as a result of that, we'll have the same holes in general. And when I teach and I work with a diverse team, they'll have enough backgrounds, enough thoughts and ideas to be able to come through and say, they'll come through and if somebody doesn't understand it, somebody from a different background will often understand it. And this is what I want to see in teams.
So two things here. One is let's get the word out. If there's a listener who knows anyone who is interested in learning big data or advancing their career who is also a minority, they should go check out Jesse's scholarship to get world-class training in big data. And the second part here is really around how diverse teams outperform homogenous teams over and over again. With your background in studying creativity, do you see the levels of creativity differing between these two groups?
Oh, definitely. That was kind of the ideas that I was talking about, where when I talk to a team about here's how should we solve this problem. So when I'm training a team, we'll talk about here's this use case, we want to solve this. What will often happen with teams without diversity is they'll give me a single answer, and it's due to the same background of this is how we always think. When I teach a diverse team, they'll give me 5, 10 different answers to that. And the benefit to a team or to a company when you have 5 to 10 different answers, you can choose the best of those 10. You could mix some of those 10. But when you only have a single answer, everything is just around that. Nobody else can say, hey, we should do it this way or that way.
So diverse teams are more creative. They come up with more ideas.
That's what I found. Okay. And another thing I found interesting is What I found is my thoughts on this weren't very pervasive throughout tech or industry, and then I found I was listening to a video, and the guy was saying the same thing as I was in terms of what diversity means. We don't just do diversity. We can do diversity for diversity's sake, but I think the real reason and the real encouragement for businesses is that we should do diversity because it changes the teams. And he was saying that same thing. He said teams that are diverse are this way and that way. So I reached out to him and we talked about it. And he's writing a book on that. He does a lot with he has a PhD in psychology. So it was interesting to get some of that more academic validation on what I'm seeing.
That's awesome. This is so great. It's an issue that really matters a lot to me as well, so I'll definitely make sure that the scholarship gets plugged in the show notes and linked to. My next question is really about your success in the premium consulting space. Who is your target market? Who is your ideal customer? How do you reach these people and take them from a cold lead to a warm contact?
So ideal customer is a company that's starting that big data journey. They're starting to go through and saying, okay, I want to start doing big data. I'm hitting these problems. Ideally, they'll talk to me and reach out to me before they start hitting code, before they start creating teams. We can fix it later on, but it's so much cheaper, so much easier and faster to do it right from the beginning. So that's what I do. As far as lead gen, I work with Michael. He's doing some of the lead gen and marketing for me. I also do a lot of the lead gen through the conferences that I speak at, through the posts that I do. My next biggest lead gen is a book I wrote, and that's a book on creating data engineering teams. What I'm doing there is I'm actually writing down a lot of the things that I actually teach at these Fortune 100 companies and saying, do this, do this, do this. And this is down to the letter. This is what I tell them. This isn't something different that I'm holding out and I'm holding back from. So what they're able to do is they're able to self-assess and say, hey, I need help here, here, and here, and reach out to me through that. So I'm looking for that book to be a great lead gen.
Now, I read your book on data engineering, and I think the next question that needs to be answered is, what is a data engineer? Because we've all heard of data science, and most people don't really even know what data science is. So I think it would be really helpful to hear what data engineering is, and then if you also want to talk about what data science is, that would be helpful as well.
Sure. And I talk about these in the book as well. So if you want to get longer definitions of things. So a data scientist is a person with a stats and probabilities background who also has a background in programming, and usually that's on the low side of what their abilities. So they're primarily on the math side with some ability to program. The data engineer is the complement to that. So the data engineer has the programming side, the distributed systems side, that has maybe a minimal background in analysis, maybe on the high side some kind of background in probabilities. So what they'll do is they'll complement each other in that data scientists generally write pretty bad code, let's put it bluntly. They generally don't know how to engineer. They don't know how to put these systems into production. That's what a data engineer helps them do. Is the data scientist is creating some code, some math, some kind of model, and then the data engineer is working with that. So if you go through the book, you'll actually have an illustration there showing here's what data engineers do, here's what data scientists do along that axis.
And I found it incredibly helpful because I'm friends with lots of data scientists, and they tend to have backgrounds exactly like you described in stats, probability, math, actuarial sciences, that sort of thing. And their programming skills seem fairly minimum. They don't usually, in my experience, they don't really know about the technology as much as they know about the theory of analytics. And what you're suggesting is that on the flip side, there are essentially people who are into the data engineering, who understand distributed systems, who understand the operation of many complex systems interacting with one another, the data pipeline, and they're more focused on sort of the hands-on implementation of the algorithms that the data scientists are producing. Is that all right? Am I on the mark there?
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay, great. Do you have any other points that you'd like to make on data engineering and how, especially companies at the startup stage or small medium business stage, should think about data engineering as they scale up?
So yes, obviously the book goes way more deeper into it. If you either think you may be going this route or will be going this route, and read the book. It's going to give you the background and the help so that you aren't hitting problems later on.
Mm-hmm.
So a data engineering team is not a data warehousing team. A data engineering team is actually a multidisciplinary team, often made up primarily of data engineers. Other things is it's not cheap, it's not easy, it's not fast. I go into all that. So when you are, as I talk to sometimes startups or something, and they're saying, hey, we want to get into this big data thing. We keep on reading about it. And I'll talk to them and I'll say, okay, what's your budget? What's your use case? That sort of thing. What they're thinking is that it's going to be like a small data problem. It isn't. It's far, far more complex. You're not going to have your web developer move over to this and start writing some big data code for you. Those are the things that you, at its core, need to understand.
So I want to illustrate these differences really quickly. I work in small data all the time. People will come to me and they'll say, hey, I want to build an app or I want to build a website. And it's usually pretty simple. It's the type of thing that you can do with a designer and an engineer. And most of the time I'm advising, hey, this is not cheap, it's expensive, and it's going to take 6 months. And that's always a surprise. I'm curious, you're having this conversation with startups and large businesses, Fortune 100s as well. It must be an order of magnitude more expensive and more complex. How do you have that conversation and explain, hey, here are the costs, but here are the benefits?
Well, that's what we do. It's usually when I'm talking at a Fortune 100 company or teaching or mentoring them, they're kind of at that point where they have nothing else. They're at that train heading towards a brick wall where they either do this or their business fails at that. They stop doing it. So they don't really have a choice. And the way I message that is exactly that. Your train, you're heading towards a rebar reinforced concrete wall. You need to put this effort into fixing that and changing that. Until you do that, here's what's going to happen. Here's what we talked about initially of messaging negatively. I actually talk about this is the negative problem that we'll have. You will have to come to your management, or you'll have to go to the CEO and say, we can't do that. We can't scale. For larger businesses, it's what I talk about is they'll say, okay, well, we're a year away. And I say, well, what if you acquire another company? How far away are you at that point? Would you have to tell as part of your due diligence, you have to come to the CEO and say, I'm sorry, we can never integrate our two systems because we can't scale. That's a big issue. More on the smaller business side is if you are unable to either pay people or get the right people, what you may have to do is you may have to start small scale. With small data, and then know that you have that technical debt, know that you're going to have to pay that off eventually, and go from there. What I don't suggest people do is to half-ass this and do a bunch of terrible things and then have so much technical debt that they can just never pay it down.
So as for startups specifically, as a startup moves away, they've found product market fit. They've done the idea validation. They've used Ruby on Rails and other rapid prototyping technologies to prove a concept. Now they're moving on to scaling. They need to think about this problem as soon as possible in order to avoid the catastrophic collision with technical debt that is coming down the pike. Is that the long and short of it?
That's the long and short of it. So the startups especially need to understand this. So I'll throw this out since startups will have to message me and ask me this is, okay, how can I get that developer to join me? I'm a small startup, and what I often find is that they're thinking that the developer is a cog within that wheel rather than this developer is actually core to my business. and so they'll not offer them equity, or they won't do something like that. And when I say this technologist should actually be a co-founder, or they should be a CTO, or they should be given a substantial position within your company, rather than let me have this mercenary come in, or the low paid cog.
Right, and you talk about this in your book about the data engineering team being a data hub. Can you plug the title of the book one more time so people know what to look for?
Yeah, it's called Data Engineering Teams. If you want to go there, it's tiny.smokinghand.com/DET book. That's Delta Echo Tango book, and that will take you right there.
Awesome.
And once again, the name of the book is Data Engineering Teams, How to Create Successful Teams.
Yeah. And just reflecting on the last question for one moment, this idea of startups, when you're hiring data engineers, when you're building a big data team, you're doing it more than likely to create a competitive advantage in the marketplace. On the flip side, if you're a Fortune 100 or a more established SMB and you're looking at big data, you're probably doing it more in the interest of risk mitigation, because if you don't do it now, the costs down the road will be an order of magnitude greater. Is that all right in your view?
For the Fortune 100, it's also an ability that they're going to get over their competitors. So it is a competitive advantage.
Okay. Having that team is a competitive advantage.
Having the team is a competitive advantage. The bigger advantage is the ability to leverage data and make decisions on data. That's the significant competitive advantage, and that happens whether you're a small startup or you're a Fortune 100 company. It's knowing deeply what your customers are doing, wanting, and saying to be able to either create new products, improve products, that sort of thing. So some examples of that. Recently taught at a company where they had a job that took 3 days to run. So the issues there that came from that is there was the operations side, where if the job failed 2.5 days in, guess what? They start at day one and run for 3 days. That also made the business side have to wait for 3 days. It made the business side not be able to run it very often. They wanted to run it. They ran it quarterly. They wanted to run it monthly. So it causes all sorts of problems. So technical problems don't just manifest in let's say technical debt. It actually manifests all over the business. And you just may not, maybe if you're a manager or a CXO, you may not know that that's all over the place within the business. Just may not. Go ahead.
Oh, and there's a compounding effect essentially to these problems as they grow.
Oh, yeah. Then there was another compound to that where, as part of their, I guess, technical limitations, so it took 3 days. Well, it took 3 days because the business wanted 20 years of data, and due to the technical limitations, I think they had to go with 5 or 10 years of data. So there was trade-offs all over the place, and so what will happen is once they get big data back in place, I say, go back. You're probably going to have these use case growing on you, and you need to handle that accordingly.
Let me ask you this, to continue in the vein of a competitive advantage. How big do you think the global big data talent pool is? And when I say the talent pool, I mean the mature talent pool of developers, data engineers, data scientists, the sort of multidisciplinary team that you would put together. How big do you think that talent pool globally actually is?
I don't know, 500,000 globally. It's not very big in that definition. So in the definition of people with experience in this, people with the skills in this already, the talent pool is pretty small, and that's going to be an issue for businesses. That people are gaining those skills. More people are getting this and getting that experience. But it's one of the issues that I point out in the book is having a qualified data engineer on your team is important, very, very important, but you may not always be able to do it. And I offer some suggestions on when you're not able to do this. Or let's say for other companies, they may just go directly and do a consulting gig and have somebody else write that because they either can't hire the team, can't find the team, so on and so forth. So there are some ways to handle that.
And I'm under the impression that 500,000 is a pretty liberal estimate. I am definitely hearing, though, that when you're taking good, mature, big data talent off the market, you are gaining a competitive advantage and you're depriving your competition of the talent that you're all competing for.
Yeah, that's definitely true. One of the things I suggest is not to think geographically anymore. That data engineer, that qualified data engineer, may live outside your city, and that may be what you have to do in order to get that talent on your team.
Right, because if there's 500,000 big data engineers in the world, there's no way even. I mean, there's 50,000 of them aren't hanging out in San Francisco, you know. So I think that's great. We've talked a lot about big data. I want to go into sort of the last part of the conversation where we talk about more, generic fun sort of things. What ideas have you had or entertained in the past that have stuck in your head that have never materialized in the real world? What ideas would you like to actualize or what ideas would you like to see actualized even if you have nothing to do with them? Give us your best ideas. I just want you to give me and give away your best ideas that you're never actually going to act on.
I want to see more done with engineers and creativity. That's probably something I'll do later on. I want to see people, if they're passionate about what they heard me talk about with Beam, come help us on Beam. It's Apache. It's an Apache project. Join the Apache process. Before I had used Apache open source, but I'd never actually contributed to it. Since then, I've had patches on many different projects. I'm a committer on Beam. If you don't find Beam interesting, join another Apache project. Get involved. And another thing I'll point out is that not everybody has to be a programmer in order to be to contribute to an Apache project. Sometimes it's doing some kind of writing of something, a technical document, putting in a bug, fixing something small. There's all sorts of different ideas there. So there's other things that I think would be interesting to see would be more around big data quality assurance. I think that's something that could be improved on. Those are really the ones that I see. So if you start to go through big data and you start to look at it, you'll see that a significant portion, in fact, a growing portion, is all done open source. So some of the companies that had closed source projects or products open sourced them entirely, and then some were done as open source from the very beginning. So what we're able to do is to form communities, find those communities to work with, and continue to contribute to them.
So I'm hearing some project around bringing engineers together with creativity in maybe a workshop style format, and the second idea here being around contributing to open source projects like Apache Beam, and also maybe it sounds like maybe even encouraging some of these private enterprises with proprietary technologies to consider open sourcing as a route to improving communities and building community.
Yes.
Great. So my next guest, I like to ask. I asked my last guest about you, about what type of questions they would like to hear, and about I already asked you questions about your education, etc. I want to know. My next guest is going to be. She's a woman working in technology. She's one of the top B2B salespeople probably in the world. At one point, she was the #1 salesperson at Solar City. I am curious, what would you want to know from someone in her position?
I want to know what were some of the things that she found that worked really well with B2B sales, because that's a lot of what my business is B2B sales. How do I get in front of them? How do I find the right person within the organization to talk to? What does she find that closes sales well? Other ones that I personally struggle with, and I think many business owners struggle with, is how do you choose the right price point? And usually a salesperson is a good person to talk about their general knowledge of the workplace or the ecosystem is help you see how to price.
Okay, pricing models. That's great. I hadn't even thought of that yet, so that's really helpful. Sweet. Okay, next question is I have a small project in the works. I'm calling it the top tier challenge, where I would love to interview some people who are kind of in the top tier of their game. Now, I've got a dream list that includes people like Elon Musk and Sammy Kamkar and Tim Ferriss and Ramit Sethi, who we both know. My question is, who would you add to the list, and what makes that person top tier?
So I would do Larry Page and Sergey Brin. I think that they're at the top of that, and they've been the leaders and seeing what's happening within the industry. I think they would be a fascinating thing. There's Sundar. I can't remember his last name. He's the CEO of Google
I think
now.
it's Pichai.
Pichai, yes. I think he would be fascinated to talk to. I think that as I've watched him talk and grow, I think it would be very interesting to people to see how he grew and went through the company in order to become a CEO.
I also find those stories incredible because, as someone who works in startups, I often think that the only way to become the CEO of a major company is to build that company from scratch. But actually, like many CEOs of these gigantic companies start as entry-level employees and work their way up. I think the best example of that is the one you just mentioned. Also, I think the CEO of GM worked there. Her name's Mary Barra. Is that correct?
I don't remember.
I'll have somebody look it up and then. Yep, Mary Barra, Chief Executive Officer at GM. Her dad worked like in the factory, and then she joined the company right out of college in some position, and now is the CEO. I think that's incredible. The CEO of GM, that's insane. Likewise with Sundar. So that's awesome. I'm going to add those people to the list, and I'm going to try to find out what I can do to interview them. I like to have big goals like that. And the other question that's sort of in addition to that question is, who in your network that I haven't met do I have to interview on Hacker Practice?
Let's see. Trying to think. You want hackers or you want just general technologists?
I'm looking for doers. Okay, so specifically anybody who's actually like on the ground making decisions or executing on work. Okay, so I'm not interested in pundits or theorizers. I'm interested in practitioners, and that could be a hacker, it could be a salesperson, it could be an entrepreneur, it could be a founder, anyone who's really an executor.
So there's a guy who's writing a book on data science and for O'Reilly, and I was introduced to him and I've kept in touch with him. His name is Russell Journey. He would actually be interesting to talk about some of the data science side. So I mostly focus obviously on the data engineering teams, data engineer side. He'd be able to talk about some of that. He was one of the leading data scientists at LinkedIn.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So he would be interesting to talk, and he's writing a book. He's creating some other content around that. So I think it would be interesting for your listeners as well.
This is great. I've got an interview scheduled with a senior data scientist over at one of the country's biggest insurance providers. So I think that this could be an excellent theme to explore in a series of episodes. Is data science, risk, and practical applications of such. So that's great. I've got two more questions, and then we're gonna one more question, then we're gonna wrap it up. I want to get your book recommendations. I know we're both big Ayn Rand fans, so I'd love to hear your take on Ayn Rand and objectivism. Last year I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and they're both going to get read again. Talk to me about Ayn Rand, talk to me about objectivism, talk to me about your other book recommendations.
So for me, Ayn Rand was an interesting thing where I was brought up, taught, and really shoved down my throat that money was evil. All money was evil. And I think reading Ayn Rand really showed that yeah, you can be evil with money, but it's a necessary thing. You actually, I think I can't remember the guy's name. He gives this impassioned speech about it, where unless we have money or whatever the equivalent of money is, we're all slaves. and we're enslaved to each other. And money is what we use to say, please do this thing for me. Please please be motivated to do this. So for me, it was kind of liberating to get away from that thought that money is inherently evil, and instead money has a purpose, a specific purpose. And that also helped me understand that we have to identify what a person's selfish gain is. I think that's another thing that she talks about in there is when we go through and we talk about how everybody just has a general good, or they're doing this or that for the general good of society, that isn't sustainable in my opinion. They have to specifically identify the selfish gain that somebody gets. And when I teach, I specifically identify their selfish gain, and I tell them that I don't say selfish gain. I say, this is how you are going to benefit that. This is how we're motivated as individuals in order to do something. We need to have and identify what it is we get out of that. Sometimes I'll teach at a company where it's a bunch of enterprise people who are pretty bored, and I'll say, hey, best case or worst case, this could be the way for you to get a different job or become more interested in your job. Other book recommendations that I have, if you love history, I'm blanking on his last name, Will Durant.
Yeah.
Yes, Will Durant. If you want the exhaustive, I mean, it is tomes and tomes. I've listened to them on audiobook. That's how I got through them. Do audiobooks, don't read them. And I went through everything of Will Durant. It's absolutely fascinating.
Any particular place to start for someone? Like, I've read probably 3 or 4 of his books, especially like History of Philosophy, I think is one of them. But where would you start if someone was totally new to Will Durant?
I don't have a specific one to recommend. I would just say, if you're interested in this, just dig into everything, and he does an incredible job. Let's see, other books that I've enjoyed. If you are like me and you are a programmer and you thought that starting a business, running a business was some kind of difficult thing, or something out of that mere mortals couldn't do. So I spent my professional life as a programmer, heads down coder, watching businesses fail and very few times succeed, which gave me this this thought that, hey, this is pretty difficult. Mere mortals can't do this. I obviously can't do this. So I'm gonna have to try to remember. It was the something MBA. It was. I'd have to look it up.
Is it like the 90-minute MBA or something like that?
No, it was the one where he just kind of read all these MBA books and distilled them down into a single book that went through everything from the very beginning, from the very, very start of it. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick.
And while you're doing that, again, we can link to the book recommendations. I will pull out a couple of Will Durant's most popular books and make sure that the links are available in the show notes.
And
by the way, the character that you were thinking of in
here it
Atlas
is.
Shrugged is Francisco d'Ancona.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Personal MBA, Master the Art of Business by Josh Kaufman. That was one he was actually interviewed by Ramit, and he talked about a very similar journey of thinking that a heads-down programmer can't run a business because we don't have MBAs. And what I'm finding as I hit MBAs and talk to MBAs is that they know how to run a team, but they don't know how to start and run businesses. And I think that's a very big distinction. An MBA does not know how to start a business, doesn't really understand how to identify. They're not entrepreneurs, basically.
Great. Personal MBA by Josh Kaufman. I think I've read something else by him as well. Did he write that book, The First 20 Hours?
I don't know.
I think that's
the only book I've read of his.
Well, I'm definitely going to check that one out because that's been on my list for a while, and I think I just needed another recommendation to push me beyond the tipping point into reading it. Do you have any other book recommendations?
I have another one that's an odd one. It's obviously not personal growth. I love the Vince Flynn series.
Vince Flynn?
Yeah, so the Mitch Rapp series is his main character. Ever since Tom Clancy passed, I found that I love Tom Clancy. I've read every Tom Clancy book. The ones where they were the co-written, I didn't find those as good. So I finally found Vince Flynn. He passed about 2 years ago, and there's a new guy writing it named Kyle Mills, and he seems to have picked up the torch well. So it's called Vince Flynn is the name of the author, and then the series is called Mitch Rapp series. So if you like a good thriller, kind of the spy sort of thing, I love that one.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Jesse, thank you for such an excellent conversation. As usual, we've touched on so many fascinating subjects, and I cannot wait until our next conversation. Where can my audience find you, and what is your ask? What is your call to action for these people before we let them go?
You can find me at jesse-anderson.com, and that's my personal site. Or if you want to engage with my business, it's smokinghand.com. If you're a business owner and you're thinking about the big data side, go to my corporate site at smokinghand.com. Download that book; it's free, and you can make some decisions around that. If you're an individual and you're a programmer and want to become a data engineer, I have an online course for that. Go to jesse-anderson.com, sign up there for that. Mm-hmm. So do think about this. This isn't just something that you can do a single course on Coursera or something like that. This is an 8-week course that I offer. You need in-depth. You need some pretty significant help. So highly encourage that.
Just for my personal edification, how long approximately is the course in terms of hours of learning?
So the course is 8 weeks. It's about 10 to 20 hours a week of that. So this is not a when you teach this or you learn this at university, for example, this is a master's level course. This isn't something with somebody that learns at a bachelor's level.
Great. And what is the cost for someone who's buying into the course right now?
It's between $2,500 to $5,000, depending on the level that they engage at.
Awesome. Well, I think that will be coming down the pike for me personally. I'm definitely interested in these subjects and learning how to practically apply them in my life and business. Great. So we've got your websites. Your personal website, jesse-anderson.com. Your corporate website is smokinghand.com. Mr. Big Data, thank you so much for your time. Anything else you want to say before I let you go?
Thanks again, Justice, and best of luck, everybody, if you decide to go on that journey.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to Hacker Practice. Bye-bye. Hey, guys. Thanks for listening to this amazing episode of Hacker Practice with my friend Jesse. He's really a genius, one of the smartest people I know. I was so fortunate to have him on. If you enjoyed the episode today, do me a solid and click the subscribe button in iTunes or wherever you are listening. And if you really enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review on iTunes. That'll help us get to the top of the charts so more people can find Hacker Practice and learn from experts like Jesse. Finally, if you weren't a fan of the episode or if you just want to get in touch with us, go over to hackerpractice.com and give us your feedback. We love hearing from you. And I personally read every single message that comes through, and I will respond in most cases. So, if you enjoyed the episode, please give us some love, hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and give us some feedback at hackerpractice.com. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.